That's how I learned to turn on my microphone like I've never done before. Need to call the meeting for the Interim Committee on Tourism, Small Business, Information Technology. At this point in time, Sasha, would you call the roll?
Senator Boswell. Senator Funky Fromeyer. Senator Gardler. Senator Harper Angel.
Here.
Senator Howell. Senator Mills. Senator Storm.
Here.
Senator Thomas. Senator Wheeler.
Here.
Senator Wilson.
Here.
Senator Representative All.
Now, don't give me a demotion already. I am present.
Representative Baker. Here. Representative Dotson. Here. Representative Pfister.
Here.
Representative Frazier Gordon.
Yes, ma'am.
Representative Freeland. Representative Fugit.
Yes, here.
Representative Grossberg.
Present.
Representative Heath.
Here.
Representative Kulkarni. Representative Lawrence. Representative Maddox. Representative Massaroni.
Here.
Representative McPherson.
Here.
Representative Pollock.
Here.
Representative Reed.
Here.
Representative Roberts.
Here.
Representative Stalker.
Present.
Representative Tackett Lafferty.
Present.
Representative Tate. Representative Timoney. Representative Truitt.
Here.
Representative Wesley. Representative White. Representative Wilson. Representative Witten. Co-Chair Wise.
Present.
Co-Chair King.
Present.
Co-Chair Pratt.
Present. Thank you, guys. Before we get started, we need approval of the minutes of our previous meeting. Do I hear a motion? Do I get a second? Everybody in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Thank you, guys. Also, before we get started, I believe Representative Pollock has some guests he'd like to introduce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to introduce my guest today, Ms. Robbie Lynn Spears from Campbellsville, 8th grade teacher in Campbellsville Independent School, and her two guests there is Ms. Callie and Chase Milby. So please welcome her today.
And also, does anyone else have guests they'd like to introduce today? Okay, then jumping right into the meeting with our first presenters joining. Today we're going to talk about AI in government. Come up to the table, introduce yourself for the record. Looking forward to your testimony. Make sure your microphone is green and in front of you.
Hello.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Bob Babbage with Babbage Co-Founder representing Gartner. You want to introduce yourself now?
And I'm Alicia Schollard. I'm with Gartner.
Would you pull the microphone just a little bit closer, please?
How about that?
Thank you, ma'am.
Perfect. I'm Alicia Schollard, and I'm with Gartner. And we have Ben Kaner joining us from Gartner as well, online.
Please.
I'm Ben Kaner
So
from Gartner. I'm in the
I'll
UK.
start if you are okay, Mr. Chairman, and to your co-chairs, Wise and King, and all of you members. It's a terrific pleasure to be with you today and think about a subject of consequence. Perhaps the hardest part of your job is keeping up with everything, changes, updates, advancements, and knowing how best to set policy and law and spending. One of the most compelling and complex and creative and concerning subjects before us now is artificial intelligence, or AI. It's algorithms finding patterns, but there's a lot more to it than that. 79% of America's CEOs just told Fortune magazine it will make them more efficient. Another study at the same time, this was all last week, said that we'll see a drop in the service workforce comprised by a majority of female employees by 2030, all because they will be replaced by AI. 51% of K-12 teachers are already using AI in routine matters, Forbes magazine says, and they add examples in healthcare, farming, basic writing, and other things. The commentary is everywhere. You see it in all the news briefs. The White House said that they'd voluntarily gotten 7 AI companies to agree to cooperate on rules, followed quickly by a global expert who said there's no way to do that. You can't enforce those rules. So some of those questions will fall to you. This opens up a number of questions about advertising, political advertising, copyrights, and so on. Our team, Babbage Co-Founders, is privileged to work with Gartner, which is the world's largest consultancy. Gartner is way, way ahead of who does AI, who should. the myriad pluses along with the major concerns that are expressed by leaders like you. Leaders of all descriptions around the planet are relying on Gartner regularly because they have several thousand subject matter experts around the planet, including one on the screen from England. So please be thinking of the best and toughest questions to ask these two outstanding guests. They are here to help and can give us counsel and direction on any case or company or concern. It's my pleasure to first introduce Alicia Scholart from North Carolina. Her role is client executive for the Americas public sector. She spent a lot of time here already. The Kentucky Lottery and Education Cabinet, among others, draw on Gartner for help. So, Alicia.
Thank you. It's good to be with you all today. So before we introduce the subject matter expert, Ben Kaner, who's going to speak with us on generative AI, I want to share with you a few reasons why Gartner is uniquely qualified to offer this briefing. And also why this topic is so important to state and local leaders like yourselves. First, let's talk a little bit about why Gartner. So let's see if we could advance the slides to the one with the capital on it. One more. Perfect, thank you. Gartner is the world's largest research and advisory firm, and we're quoted in reputable news sources over 180 times per week. When describing what we do here at Gartner, some folks will say that we're like a Google search. If you don't know something, you can just Google it, right? But I'm not sure that that's the best way to describe what we do, because not everything that you look up on Google is correct. I mean, have you ever tried to diagnose your headache or your stomach ache? It was a tumor, right? Yeah, it was when I looked it up. So I prefer to think of us more in real estate terms. When in a real estate transaction, you have a homeowner, and a homeowner wants you to buy their house. Their house is the best one on the market. After all, it's where they raise Sally and Bobby, and they have happy memories. And then you have a real estate agent. A real estate agent just wants you to buy a house. Any house will do, and frankly, the more expensive, the better, right? And then you have the home inspector. The home inspector doesn't really care if you buy the house or not. Their job is simply to use their knowledge and skills to review the house that you like and help inform you of exactly what you're getting into here. Is there a new roof in your future? Does it have weeping insulation? They look in all the nooks and crannies to help give you a broader understanding of the true investment you're about to take or risk you're about to take. And then you can use that advice to make decisions that fit your family and your needs the best. Here at Gartner, we've been acting like a home inspector, right? And we've been working with state and local governments for over 42 years by providing actionable and objective insights that help agencies take advantage of technologies and deliver better citizen services. To do this, we have over 2,500 subject matter experts that we refer to as analysts, like Ben. They spend an awful lot of time researching over 1,500 different technology topics. To do this research, analysts meet with vendors to understand their products and services, features and benefits, and how they operate. And we do this 23,000 times a year. We also talk with clients about what's going on in their workspace, and we do that 490,000 times every year. These interactions help our analysts, our subject matter experts, to understand what's working, what's not, and why. They have a broad and unparalleled purview of the technology landscape. When folks come to us for our perspective, our benchmarks, and our insights, they can be assured that they're getting the real results and not just the result of going fishing in a very small pond. Why do I tell you these things? Because it's important to know where your news is coming from. We have a very rigorous research methodology to ensure that we remain objective and unbiased. We believe that being objective and accurate are two of the most important things that we can be. In advance of this meeting, I met with technology leaders from some agencies here in Kentucky to get their perspective on generative AI. Everyone that I met with was really intrigued, and they recognized that the new use of this existing technology could have profound impacts. As an example of how generative AI could impact students in Kentucky, I want to share with you an example from Khan Academy, an online tutoring organization. And Ben, if you could do the other group, thank you. So back in 1984, Benjamin S. Bloom did a study to research whether group instruction was as effective as one-to-one tutoring. What he found was that when given one-to-one tutoring, even a very average student could perform at exceptional levels. So why didn't schools just start giving all the kids one-to-one tutoring? I mean, obviously that's not very scalable, right? I mean, who can afford to give every student a one-to-one human being to walk with them and talk with them and teach them everything that they need to know every day? It's just not a realistic goal. But with generative AI, maybe it is. So at Khan Academy, they actually used generative AI and wrote code that allows the one-to-one tutor situation. So the computer can act as a tutor with natural language, prompting the students with learning cues and questions that feel like a real live tutor. And the results are stunning. Students in Kentucky already have one-to-one devices. You're ahead of the rest of the country here. So what if you turned those one-to-one devices into tutors? If you did that, it's very possible that Kentucky students could leapfrog not only other states, but other countries. How would that impact Kentucky? How would that make you a destination state? How would that impact your workforce? And fill in those gaps. The average agency experiences right now around between a 25 and 30% vacancy rate. That's not just in Kentucky, that's across the country. In today's presentation, Ben is going to take a moment to define what is generative AI. What does that technology look like? He's going to share some potential examples, or we call them use cases, of how generative AI could help governments and agencies provide better services to citizens, as well as some potential risks. Then he's going to share how other states and governments from around the globe are standing up some guardrails to help ensure that as we explore this new use of technology, we're doing so as safely as possible. If you have questions during the briefing, please feel free to ask. When we have about 5 minutes left, I'll jump back in and wrap us up. Thank you. Ben?
Hello, everybody. My name is Ben Kane. I'm a Senior Director Analyst at Gartner. As you can probably tell from my accent and my background, I'm in the UK. And the subject we have today is a point of view. And yes, inevitably, I used a generative AI mechanism to generate this rather creepy picture based on, well, why wouldn't you in the circumstances? The first thing is, this is where all the hype came from. But this is, in fact, not true. It is not all about ChatGPT. It's not even just about generative AI. What I'll do first is just so some of the things you may have read about when you're considering generative AI from different points of view. And depending on how much science fiction you've read, you may have seen things about super intelligent or self-aware AIs.
Hey,
but
Ben.
let's start with reality.
Ben.
Yeah.
We're having, is anyone else having a tricky time hearing? Is it possible to turn the volume up on our end, or could you maybe talk a little louder, Ben?
Does this help?
Now.
Say again.
Can you hear this now?
Can you hold up just a second? We'll get tech people in and turn the volume up a little bit, please.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Shall I say testing to make sure?
That's much better.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant.
Yes.
So the range of capabilities in classical academic terms runs from reactive AIs. If an organization is selling this to you, they will call it an expert system. It's easier to sell an expert system than a reactive system. It means the same thing. It's a narrow single task. It has captured some human knowledge, but it can't learn. Then we run into a limited memory AI. That's where we are now. It predicts a short distance into the future. So autonomous and self-driving vehicles, for those people who have various different forms of cars and are seeing the things about self-driving Teslas or whatever it happens to be, is an example. Generative AI does the same thing. It generates the next word or phrase or component of a picture that looks like it came from an original data source. If you want to go a little bit more philosophical, you can talk about theory of mind, where you actually pretend or attempt to simulate the way that a human mind works. That is not what exists yet. And of course, self-aware is still in the realms of science fiction. Another way of looking at it is narrow versus general versus superintelligent. Narrow is very specific to a task, like voice recognition from your Siri or Alexa or whatever. General AI is ability to learn and understand or simulate that as well as a human. And we're not actually there yet, despite all the hype. And superintelligent is difficult to conceive of, really, because we are only human, and is still in the realms of sci-fi, hopefully for quite a while. So that's where we are now. Now, there's the other way of looking at this is there's three different kinds of uses of AI. One area is machine learning. Machine learning is the basis of the other forms as well, but is basically you can use it to find patterns, soft matching, risk assessments, voice recognition. Remember your use of Siri or Alexa or whatever, or Hey Google. Anomalies, fraud, diagnoses. If anybody's been for cancer scans, they're starting to use AI for determining whether a cancer is present in a way that is actually improved on the human ability to support it. Very powerful, very useful in particular areas. Predictive analytics is prediction of flow or modeling complex systems, simulations of systems. Protein folding is an interesting example. Google DeepMind managed to use machine learning on known proteins, and then from that derived how it could work out how proteins folded from amino acid sequences for everything else within a few months. Now, that is immensely powerful compared with what anybody else could do beforehand, and is also extremely powerful in areas such as drug development and medical treatments. But that is not generative AI. Generative AI, very specifically, creates an output that looks like it came from an original data set. A picture that looks like a picture that looks like a human. A text that looks like it's written by Shakespeare, not written by Shakespeare. Music that sounds like it was by either Bach or the Beatles, depending on which version you use. Creates outputs that look or sound like they came from an original data set. Doesn't mean to say it did, and it does not mean to say it's true. It's like having a very, very convincing person tell you something that may be complete rubbish. Now they're getting closer, but there's still a gap there, because it actually works by generating information and then having a discriminator behind it to say, does that look like the original? Yes or no? And it evolves the generator until it's continuously producing information that looks like the original, but it's generating it. It is not real information. There are different levels of power of AI, and here's a way of looking at it. It's not the only way of looking at it, but it's quite a useful scale. Very low levels of power is where essentially there's always a human in the loop, and the human unequivocally has the accountability and final say. So if it's wrong, you don't go complaining to the AI system, you go to the human. You can't say the dog ate my homework in this case, it's still yours. The issues with this is there is still anchor bias. If the AI comes up with an answer, the human who is doing the assurance or final say tends to anchor on the information they're first giving. So there's still some levels of bias that come in, but that bias exists with a human anyway. Medium levels of power is where instead of having the human unequivocally responsible for every single part of the answer, is where you just basically, the human light touch says, yes, that's okay, yes, that's okay. If you can imagine a human overseeing a chatbot. They see 15 or 20 streams, they're doing a little bit of moderation. Now, okay, that's fine, but humans are quite lazy. They will tend to habituate to the answers and then keep on pressing yes. The computer said yes. And that starts to generate higher levels of bias in the system. You can have high levels of power, but relatively low scale. What I mean by this, slightly awkwardly, is decisions that are made almost completely autonomously, but the damage is limited. So the example of autonomous vehicles, you're only killing one person at a time, which is quite bad, but at least it's not at scale. High levels of power and high scale is if you were to allow the system to make decisions on your behalf, affecting large numbers of people. Now that means you're starting to embed any bias or any inaccuracies in your model into the decisions made affecting an entire population. Now that's potentially disastrous if you don't assure it well. And there is an example from the Netherlands of a case where it wasn't generated by AI, but they had a policy on how they assessed risk for childcare support payments, which turned out to be very biased and inaccurate and led to the resignation of the whole government, 2019. That's quite a big impact, folks. But that can lead to major scandal and a significant loss of trust in government. That is not a good thing. Now, the EU's actually got a set of regulations now out, which has been passed through European Parliament. And that has at the top level unacceptable use, life-changing decisions made automatically with insufficient human governance. Now, the question is, that's a very high-risk position to be in, and I would say you should be shying well away from that. So, moving on. Let's talk about generative AI specifically. Now, people think that there's only a small number of players in the marketplace because they've seen all the ones that keep on coming up on the press. But there's large numbers. This is just a small set of the types that are available. So don't regard this as exclusive or complete, and it's changing every day. It is a very, very busy field at the moment, as you can possibly imagine. So some of them generate text. You can have ones that generate images. In fact, some of the things that sit on your mobile phone are forms of generative AI for images. Video, the internet is likely to use video generation for the things that it usually uses them for. And voice. Well, voice is quite interesting. Has anybody here ever been asked or demanded by somebody over the phone that they provide them some information on an urgent basis? Because if they have, are you sure that that's a human on the other end of the line, or is it that the voice of the person you think it is generated by a voice synthesizing system? You only need 10 seconds of voice sample to do this. And it can be pretty convincing to a human on the other end. There is already examples of extortion happening by people generating voice from a social media clip, of which there are an awful lot around on the internet. For you, obviously as politicians, for your children, whatever. And that is a threat surface which doesn't have a technical defense. It is a behavioral maturity that we're going to have to learn. But the core thing that's in government use that people are thinking about is chatbots, data, chats, documents, all these kinds of things, which is actually in the text arena. So let's look at what a generative AI model is at its simplest level. It's a neural network, which means originally it was developed on the way that human neurons function in terms of increasing or decreasing links depending on how many times you've experienced an event, creating a strong memory, that kind of thing. Many parameters. The largest models are currently up to about 1 trillion. That's 1,000 billion parameters in the model. That's a lot. But when you consider that a standard human brain, which runs on the whole power of 20 watts, has over 100 trillion neuron connections in it, we're not quite there yet, not by a long chalk. And they don't quite parallel, but it's quite useful to consider that. It's trained on large quantities of text or other data if you're talking about image. Most of the data is from public data sets. I'm sure you're all aware that the internet is completely impartial and totally unbiased about every single subject it covers, he says. But not exactly. There's embedded bias in the culture of the internet of various different descriptions in every direction. And certainly a bias tending towards US environment and US politics, which is interesting for countries outside the US. It can be self-supervised or semi-supervised. The problem with self-supervised is it incorporates that bias without judgment. And semi-supervised learning is where you try and moderate it to actually create something which is actually sustainable and doesn't go completely off-piste. But the interesting point is it's got emergent behaviors, which means it gets interesting results because they're not what you would expect. And some of those patterns are getting quite sophisticated now. Answering questions, improving on mathematics formulas, all these kinds of things. It's saying, well, these emergent behaviors are not what we programmed into it, yes, but it's a learning pattern system over a large amount of data. You cannot completely predict the results. Another way of looking at this, which may be really useful to you, or at least I hope it is what it actually does. Now, if you read down this, these large language models are large. They have read a lot, okay? Terribly, terribly articulate. In almost any dialect, in fact. Can speak multiple languages. Can draft rapidly. Is naive. It's not a human. Doesn't have human experiences. It doesn't understand right from wrong. It's naive. Can produce interesting ideas. Can learn from what it's given. You can retrain it. You can add a fine-tuning. You can add a prompt to it, which includes the data on which you want it to act. Might not understand sensitivity or privacy. Now, the interesting point on that one is if you look at that level of information, that also describes a completely different beast. It's almost a precise description of a graduate intern. And the point about that is, what would you trust a graduate intern with? Giving advice on policy? Maybe. Direct responses to residents about what the best action to do in a legal case? No, probably not a graduate intern. I think you might want a human supervisor there. And that's exactly the same principle. And that's quite a useful thing. It says, what would you trust a graduate intern with? Now, if you gave every member of your agencies a graduate intern to help them do their work, and they would supervise them and they'd interact with them and they'd ask them to do the grunt work and all these kinds of things, or go off and find me documents on this, you can see how that would be very, very great boost to productivity. But you'd still want that human in the loop at this stage. So the question comes, okay, given that, what would you use it for? What are the examples, use cases in government?
Hey, Ben, before we jump into use cases, should we pause and take some questions? Does anybody have any questions for Ben at this point?
Have any questions? Anybody got any questions at this point in time? I think we're ready to keep moving.
Okay, let's keep it going. Thanks.
Sure. Now let's look at these. If you actually look at these, they're quite common things. I mean, asking policy questions, freedom of information requests, ramping on staff, having the, like you tend to ask the person in the seat next to you how to claim your expenses or get a new stapler. Well, you can ask the system instead. Process guides, creating process guides. They're all pretty good use cases. It can help with all of these kinds of things. But interestingly enough, the ones that people tend to jump to because it says it's a chatbot are the ones at the bottom, engaging citizens and supporting operations at the front end. The problem is that's where the gap between what's generated by the AI system and when a decision affects a resident of Kentucky is the smallest, and therefore is also the point at which it's quite high risk because I haven't got necessarily enough of a human in the loop. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about the early pilots for people experimenting with it, they're very aware of the limitations. But when you try and scale it to the entire population, you start to get, am I sure? Even for the triage and prioritization and all these kinds of things in operations, which happens quite a lot. But it does have potential in these areas as the systems mature. I would just suggest that's not quite yet. That said, there's some very, very strong use cases in the back office, recruitment processes, ramping on staff, creating new training materials when regulations change, creating scenarios so that someone can inform somebody who's having to deal with difficult cases how they could improve the way they operate by using ChatGPT. It's a sort of a corollary for your staff of the education use of a tutor. Interestingly enough, there is an IT use case which is very powerful. Most government organizations have a lot of old systems. Simply because of the way that governments operate, they tend to sweat the assets for as long as they can, because who replaces if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if you do have legacy systems, they tend to get rigid over time, so you cannot deliver changes in policy. And it costs more to change, more to support, and the people who knew how it worked have now retired. So having a system which can delve into that old code, remember it doesn't just speak English, delve into that old code and discover how it works so that you can refactor it onto new systems, thereby reducing your technical debt, is actually a very powerful use case for working out how to use these systems, because it means you can release your old systems, move on to new systems at lower risk and at higher speed with less cost. It's not perfect. You still have to do the testing. You still have to have the intelligent humans making sure that it works in the way that you expected, but it can accelerate that capability.
I think it's important to note that, if agencies are experiencing vacancy rates of 25 to 30%, and they're trying to modernize a lot of these legacy systems where the code has been built on year over year. Every time there's a mandate or a legislative change, they code over it and they code over it and they code over it. And you end up with these huge monolithic systems that take years and years to break down. Think about some of the modernization efforts that have been going on here in Kentucky with large technology systems. There's a high failure rate. So if you can take a tool like generative AI to take some of the pressure off, to do it right, to do it well, and to take the pressure off of the teams, that's a huge use case. So there's a lot of downstream impact, I think, in these.
Alicia is completely correct, yeah. And we are seeing that as one of the primary use cases that people are starting to focus on, because government in particular has this as a challenge. But the areas around training is also very powerful in the early phases and these kinds of things. Generating materials, obviously checked by a human, but you can enrich those kinds of processes quite fast. That's the early use cases. But as you go through those use cases, you need to say, well, just because it's a shiny hammer doesn't mean to say that everything's a nail. So you have to think, what do I actually use it on? Which parts of our functions do I use it on? Why do I use it for that and not something else? So is it feasible, all these kinds of things? So let's start by looking at, well, in this particular case, I'm going to use protective services. So we've done a capability reference model for human services. And this particular area is things like child protection or elderly protection. But when you actually look at what happens, it's quite common. You've got referral queues, you've got triage, you've establishing case information. So, okay, that's the activities you do. Those are the technical capabilities you need. Which of those will benefit from this new technology? Not all of them. Let's not just scatter it around and assume it's like magic dust. This is actually something where you need to focus on what can be achieved, what benefits can be delivered, and how. And as you go through it, you say, okay, these are the areas, perhaps, where you say there is a potential for the use of this kind of technology. Then you have to say, okay, that's a whole set of initiatives. And this is just one area, because you've got eligibility enrollment and case management. You've got payment systems, you've got service provider. There's lots of different capabilities. And this is just in human services, never mind in protective services or taxation or democratic services, all the rest. Okay, but in these areas, I can use it for these purposes. Now, which do I prioritize? So you need a schema for prioritization, which is dispassionate and actually will get your resources to where they should go, or rather than just because somebody shouted loudest. So one of the things Gartner does is we go through these kinds of things from multiple points of view, from multiple organizations all across the world. And all I can say is, since this came up, my diary rather exploded with calls from every single continent. No calls from Antarctica yet, I'm pleased to say, but everywhere else. But you actually have to score across business value, societal outcome you wish to achieve. What is the future you want to achieve? What are the operational efficiencies, the cost of operation of your organization, What is the risk to service? Now, the risk may be complete service failure. That's quite embarrassing. It could be an adverse event for a child, which will be very bad for that child and bad for the reputation if that's what happens with your current systems. Or it could be you decrease the risk by addressing your technical debt, so it's less likely your system falls over. If you're not careful, it's increased the risk by incorporating bias where you didn't have it before. So, but you have to score on those. You need at least one of these to improve to make it viable at all. One of these must improve, otherwise it wasn't much point in doing. But more interestingly, you need all three feasibilities. One of them is obviously technology. If the technology doesn't work, it doesn't work. Now, that's usually fixable over time, but it's not always easy. But it's only 1/6 of the challenge. If the target organization cannot adapt to this new technology, and that's actually the hardest point and is actually the most common point of failure in major government programs across the world. If the organization cannot adapt because they don't have the skills or the governance or the maturity or even the operating model, the incentives are wrong, they simply will not use that technology effectively, then you've sort of wasted your money. And of course, being AI, it's a bit sensitive. Now, as you go through this model, you'll discover that some of the might call pet projects of senior people will end up perhaps on the left-hand end. They say it's high business value, but actually they haven't really thought about what the organization change is going to be. How disruptive is it going to be, and are they going to be able to adapt? These are ones where I would say, take care. It's not obvious that it's going to be the right thing. You should be starting on the ones where you have high feasibility, even if it's only low to medium business value, because you know it'll deliver the outcomes. And from that, you can learn. From that, you can gain the maturity to actually start dragging these other ones back into the green space, in which case you can do it in an ordered fashion. But that means to say that it's not just about what seems most important in terms of business value. The feasibility is utterly critical. So the recommendation is simple as appraise which capabilities can benefit from which business capabilities from which generative AI capabilities. You need to aggregate the value and ensure feasibility, remembering three things. This technology, generative AI, large language model, is currently immature. It is changing rapidly. It is volatile. Second, the most common cause of failure is not the technology. Third, quite sensitive, this. Remember that this will blow back if you get it wrong. And it's sensitive to negative news, and who will it blow back on is a question you have to ask yourselves. So there's some risks. Large language models learn from existing data, which means they will incorporate the biases in that data. The large language model is not an up-to-date source of information in and of itself. You could not use this to answer a chat after an environmental event, such as, I don't know, a tornado or a storm, and assume that it will provide up-to-date information. It will not. That is not how it works. It bases its answers on that network of 1 trillion parameters, which was built when this model was last updated 6 months ago or whatever. There is no conceptual model of right or wrong in this. They try and put the filters on, but there's no direct theory of mind here. The data provided may therefore be seriously misleading. That's what's called a hallucination. The moment there's questions about copyright, whilst the products cannot be copyrighted, if it's used generative AI as scanned copyrighted material to produce its answers, can you use that model without paying the copyright owners? That's still some court cases on that. It is not settled. And of course, you're a government. You are an authority. And particularly if you're using ChatGPT, it will give one answer. If it's wrong, how does that blow back? Now, you can take a view on this. And if you show that it's generally speaking higher value, then of course you can accept that and say, we will take that risk. But it's not up to IT to accept that risk. It is up to you as legislators and policymakers. Very important, this. Just because government is using it does not mean to say that government is the only user of this system. There are malign users. But remember that external users, if you want to find something out about Kentucky, you tend not to go to the government websites. You tend to go to Google first, or Bing. But there are also malign uses. You can now generate large numbers of FOI requests and complaints just by generating them from AI. You can generate deep fake attacks, both on democratic systems and on government processes. People may attempt to poison the upstream well, poison the models upstream. This is already being attempted and they're fighting against it. It's not something you can protect against, but you need to be aware of. You should be monitoring, the IT systems should be monitoring the developments, and on the legal side, they need to build plans for how you react quickly. So very simply put, you mitigate the risk. Or you should have policies in place for your own use and thinking about for the state's use that generative AI is not an infallible oracle. Within the government, you should have a safe space for experimentation because people are already experimenting. Harvest the good ideas and scale them and apply them once it's safe. Sure. If you're going to do that, those higher value or low risk combinations should develop in stages. Start with human in the loop. Scale when you're ready. There is a long view, if you want to be philosophical about it. Is it a big change? Well, yes, this is a big, big, big change. Two things from the engineering side. In engineering, normally you want precision. You want that engine to run precisely every time. You want that pickup to happen exactly on time every time. You want that software to run perfectly every time. Precision and repeatability equals quality. Generative AI is not like that. It is a generative system with emergent behaviors. That variation is a feature. Which means the whole mindset around perfect responses has to go. Continuous assurance. Next question is really quite interesting. Who is making the decision? Well, it ain't a human. It's the first time that humans are subject to decisions made by a non-human entity where you can't explicitly tell you the algorithm by which it made the decision. It's not happened before. If you really want to go off on the future, then this is not yet. Don't worry about it. It's just to be aware of it. Yes, they can invent code. If they can invent code, logically, they should be able to invent a new AI, and you could get a form of evolution happening. And what do you mean by sentience in this context? At some point, that has to be addressed. Just that's not yes. Not yet. Do not get distracted by that kind of thing. So overall, our recommendations are relatively simple. The hype should be driving policy because many people are excited. That policy has to be in place to make sure this is delivered at scale and safely. There are many uses of AI. That policy does therefore cover all uses, not just the new one on the block. It is an opportunity to set up Kentucky to advance significantly in a way it provides services and the service it provides to its citizens, such as the education that Alicia mentioned earlier. You should be prioritizing initiatives on a dispassionate basis, not just who shouts loudest, but in terms of value versus feasibility. You must mitigate the risk. Do it in stages. Do not set up something where you get into it where you cannot back out in the early stages. Scale it only when the residual risk is acceptable to you. And you must keep abreast of threats. Build mitigation plans. You cannot prevent all these things happening in the outside world, but you need to be aware of them and keep up to date with them and understand how you'll respond, particularly when you're talking about deep fakes in use in terms of corruption of process and or deep fakes in the terms of the political landscape. So that's everything I was going to say. Any questions?
Thank you for your presentation. That was a lot. Like I said, it's something that's coming at us without doubt. We do have a few questions. First is Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all so much for being here today. This has been weighing heavy on my mind for several months, maybe a year now, so I appreciate you being here to explain it a little bit more. Mr. Chair, my my observation is more of a comment and a challenge for all of us as a General Assembly more than being specific to today's presentation. And that is, this is new for all of us. And the decisions we're going to be making now as a General Assembly will set the precedent. And those laws and requirements will have to be tweaked as all of this progresses. But this is a very heavy weight of responsibility that we are taking on here. So one thing that keeps coming to mind is the fiduciary responsibility we have given to professions. The ones that come to mind are lawyers, financial institutions, insurance, probably even real estate comes to mind, that they have to have the best interest of the client or the people they're representing in mind, and that's how they make decisions. I know there are always going to be bad actors, but I just hope we keep that in mind. And if and when we can put some of those requirements in place to have this type of profession going forward have the best interest of their client in mind, I think it'll serve the people we all love and serve very well. So thank you again. I'm taking this seriously, and I know we all are. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Representative King. Could I take a moment?
Yes,
to
ma'am, please.
I loved your intent, I believe, in that this is a scary thing and it is a heavy responsibility, but it's so amazing and it's so exciting, and the impact could be so positive if we approach it with a little bit of caution, but also a little bit of hope, right? So the Navy is also looking at generative AI, and recently they have started piloting a chat bot called Amelia. That's her name, and you can look her up. You can Google Navy Amelia, and you'll see this picture of this beautiful lady, and she looks real. But what they've been able to do is they've been able to consolidate multiple IT help desks that solve issues for over 1 million users. So now users, whether you're a sailor, you're a Marine, or a citizen, instead of calling this number for this service or that number for that service and then pressing 1 for this or 2 for that or 3 or 7, whatever it may be, followed by pound key. Oh, and what was your passcode again? Instead of doing all of that, all of these folks, all 1 million of these people, no matter what branch or what area they're in, whether they're here in the U.S. or abroad, they can call one number and they can get Amelia. And Amelia speaks to them in common, natural language. And then they can ask her questions about whatever's on their mind. And instead of pressing 1, 2, or 3, Amelia is able to answer their question 92% of the time within 10 minutes. And it only takes 10 seconds to get her on the phone. Think about all of the help desks that your agencies have: Health and Human Services, Corrections, Courts, Labor, Revenue, small businesses. All of these people are having questions, and they're all different questions, but they may have some common thread. If I'm a citizen and I have a question that might have to do with Medicare, well, I might have someone who's in the corrections system. I might have somebody who's in the court system. I might have questions about that. What if I could go to one place? It is a heavy responsibility, and it is a burden. But when the right guardrails are put into place, innovation doesn't need to stop.
I agree. Next, we have a question from Representative Dotson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank you for the presentation today, because I see all the benefits of AI. It's a very powerful tool. It's going to replace industries. It's going to enhance industries. And even though it may be a powerful tool, it could also be a powerful force for us to contend with in the future. And what I mean by that, just last week, my daughter, she was on ChatGPT. She said, "Dad, you can write a song. Just tell it what you want it to write." And it wrote a song just like that. And my concern is this. If it can do these things that we're seeing it do today, as technology evolves, my trepidation and fear is that as it does evolve, that it will become self-learning, that it would develop a personality. And please don't laugh on the committee, but I watched Mission Impossible last week, and AI took over the nuclear codes. So, and I know that's movie, but, art and life, they kind of correspond to some degree. So there's a fear there. And as Representative King said, I mean, this is a heavy weight. And we just can't just turn it loose and say, we have to put really good guardrails in place. And there's a lot of fear with the general public when it comes to AI. There's so much that is unknown, and it's an evolving technology. So what can you give us on the committee that would maybe put some fears to rest? We do want to evolve. We want technology to be better. We want the help centers to be able to accommodate. But at the same time, as this thing evolves, I mean, what could keep it from taking over the power grid? Somebody using AI to take over the power grid. So I'm just trying to be practical. I'm computer illiterate. I'm just a country boy. So I'm just figuring all this stuff out, piecing it together myself. But there is a lot of fear when it comes to AI and the progression it's made.
Well, I can answer part of that. AI itself does not have any desires. It is not a human. It doesn't want to take over the power grid. It really doesn't. It's not interested. It doesn't. That's one of the things you assume. If you anthropomorphize it, put a human sensibility into the AI, that's actually not how it works. It is very, very far from that kind of capability at the moment. What you probably need to be more careful of is how humans are using AI to empower themselves, give themselves a form of acceleration, or I can't call it a superpower, but do that kind of thing. And it's therefore the human actors who are misusing AI, which is much more important. And you have to be very careful to make sure it's a very clear path of liability through whatever the AI is being used for to someone who is legally actionable and liable for that. It's quite difficult to do well, and the EU has put that sort of grade of responsibilities and structure already in place, and there are guidelines coming up in quite a few other organizations to do the same. So the point is, it is possible to set up that gradation and have that kind of levels of grades of risks. That said, yes, there are malicious players, there are bad actors out there, and this does give them some more power, and you're going to have to consider those in your risk preparation. Can't quite get away from that, but it's simply not interested in trying to take over the power grid. It is much more likely that the power companies will be able to use AI to significantly improve the resilience of the power grid to attempted intrusions by other people. So there is actually considerable positivity around there. But in one sense, it's an arms race. We just got to make sure that the human benefits win.
Thanks, sir. And I think what we'll try to struggle with, we look at AI, is, that sword has two edges to it, without doubt. We use it right now, whether you know it or not. You call in for a complaint or find out something. Those call centers, if you notice, they say, tell us your problem. That's AI. They're trying to figure out where to get you to, which is good and bad. They used to have humans do that. Now we have a computer system doing that. That concerns me. We'll take away jobs. Actually, I was told a story earlier. We came back from a trip. My wife and I stopped at 2 fast food restaurants. One of them, you had to either order a kiosk, or you went through a drive-through, and I noticed the little lady did not have anything she was punched in there. When you give that order, AI is putting that food order together for you. Those are jobs that people used to have that no longer exist. And actually about a month ago, thanks to our comms team here, we put together the first paragraph, and then we did an op-ed that was printed in 2 local newspapers. AI wrote the paper for us. Trust me, there was no misspelling. The grammar is correct. That's not me. So it does have its good uses. But the one thing he kept saying that I am concerned about is biases that's going to be put into the system, good or bad, as we do this. All of us have biases, and that's going to infiltrate into that, which is something that's going to extremely concerning to me, is whether, no matter what, we are humans, and we're going to interject our biases into these programs, and it may come home that we wish we'd never done that. So again, as we go forward, this is something we're going to have to take a hard look at and start setting parameters of what we do and don't allow. But, again, it's coming, so we better get prepared for it. It's coming one way or the other. Thank you guys for your presentation. Any last things you'd like to say to wrap up, or any last questions, guys? Senator Fromeyer?
Yes, thank you. Your presentation is incredibly timely because we're grappling with so many education issues. And Kentucky continues to have some challenges, and we have fantastic teachers, but perhaps not enough. teachers. And that's where another area. Practical tools of teaching math, practical tools of teaching to read. Is there a function for this? You started to mention that, sir, in your presentation. I think, Ben, you began mentioning a little bit about that. So that feels a little less risk to me, because these are principles that have been around and that we're trying to build upon, but we have limited resources in a given day.
Oh, yes. I love that question. And I'll let Ben respond as well. But, 51% of teachers are saying that they are already using AI. And there are applications for just how does a teacher make more time to interact with the students with lesson plans. So some generative AI can help them come up with lesson plans. It can search out over all these different resources and come together and give them ideas and resources at their fingertips. So it cuts down on a lot of the administrative time that teachers don't like. Teachers want to be in front of their students. They want to be teaching. So there's some use there. And then with the Sal Khan, it's Khan Academy, KAHN. So if you go out and you search for Sal Khan TED Talk, there's an amazing TED Talk that talks about some of the use cases there, creating that one-to-one tutor. I think that's an amazing thing. One of the things that Kentucky does have is your rate of one-to-one devices is fantastic. You're ahead. So if your students already have one-to-one devices, what if you turned that device into a private tutor that can interact? My daughter, my precious daughter, she went to bed one night just thinking that she was a regular old college kid. She woke up the next morning and said she had a dream that she wanted to go to law school. I was like, honey, I think that sounds great, but you've got to have a job. She's decided that she was going to take the LSAT. So she took a practice test and she scored well enough to give her a little hope. So I said, well, if you're going to do this, you need to get a tutor. So she went on to Khan Academy and she's been using their private tutor and she's been using that. And that child who has never been a good test taker, she's nailing it. It's amazing. So I believe that the scalability, which was missing back in 1984 when we originally figured out that private tutoring was better than group, the scalability is there now with devices. Ben, did you want to add anything?
No, I completely agree. The ability to actually consider a transformation of a service through appropriate use with the appropriate guardrails is fantastic. It is very powerful, exactly the chairman said. The ability to a sharp sword cuts both ways. So you make sure that it's used properly. You teach people how to use it properly with the appropriate guardrails, maturity, and understanding. With that, great. Just make sure that you are aware of the fact that you can also industrialize the dark side as well if you are not careful. So make sure you industrialize the good side and bring maturity to the people you are teaching so that they understand the limits of what they're getting into and they understand how to absorb information properly and judge its veracity. And therefore you will have a much more better educated and much more mature population as we go forward, which would be fantastic.
And that's where Gartner can help with state agency technology leaders. We work with agency leaders to help them understand what are your peers doing, what's happening around the world, giving them that global perspective and helping them develop, giving them the tools and the resources they need to further develop the use cases that make sense to them.
Thank you. Also, Representative Mazzaroni.
Yes, when we're talking about our children, many parents in Kentucky actually have issues with the data mining of our children with the current devices we have. How much more data mining would be capable with the AI added to it? So,
oh my God.
I can answer that question.
Yes, please.
The way that you would set up such a system would mean, say, that the conversations that you had in that particular set, assuming it was set up correctly, would have no memory outside that system and that interaction with that child. Therefore, there would be no data mining. You can set it up so that there is data mining. That would be poor practice. So done correctly, you can set it up so that that problem is just simply not there. If you think about what the equivalent would be for military use of the same systems. They are very concerned about that possibility. Therefore, a lot of the engineering has gone in to make sure that you can find ways through that. It requires the correct architectural patterns and design, but that's fine. That can be done.
Thank you. And next is Representative Grossberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, let me begin by congratulating Bob Babbage on becoming a grandfather. I can't imagine what that's like, and I know he doesn't look a day older than I am, but trust me, he's just a couple of years older. I really appreciate today's conversation because AI is going to revolutionize the world the way that the invention of the electric generator and the electric motor did. And if you think back 120 years ago, no one could conceive what electricity would do to humankind. We're just scratching the surface in this conversation. And even when we say things are the realm of sci-fi is not even close to being able to predict what AI is going to be like in 20 or 30 years. And by no means should we try and ban it or dismiss it, but it's absolutely essential that we do develop these protocols and these guardrails. Just as when our grandparents first heard of the time that they were able to first split the atom in the Manhattan Project, some people said this is the end of humanity. Within 10 or 15 years, we're going to nuke each other to death. And thank God that didn't happen, but internationally, protocols and guardrails were put in place, and we've been able to harness the power of the atom now for another 2 generations. But had we not done that, none of us would be sitting here today. So all I'm asking is that we keep an open mind and we can make appropriate jokes about sci-fi movies. Speaking of which, I would say that an earlier Tom Cruise sci-fi movie is more relevant, Minority Report, because an area of AI that was not discussed today that is possible is someday some computer programmers and some legislators might say that humans are too fallible. Humans shouldn't be solving crimes with our biases. We're going to have computers do it. And humans shouldn't sit on juries or be judges because they're fallible. Computers should do it. And I say the exact opposite. I think there's something innately unique about humankind that we must maintain the control over developing our laws, enforcing our laws, judging each other, and use this just as a support tool. I would be delighted to hear that detectives were able to solve a cold case using AI. I would be delighted to hear that we are able to improve the efficiency and the accuracy and clarity of our laws by having AI support the LRC staff. What I don't want to hear about is a complete replacement, and not just because the step after replacing the support staff is replacing us, but at that point, we're taking away our basic humanity and we're just going to be cogs in the wheel of AI. And as it stands right now, there's no specific cause for concern. But as our speaker said, AI, which is just a tool and eventually will be a self-aware tool, has no interests, wants, or needs. It's not sentient. It doesn't desire anything, but it can be programmed for great evil. And to me, the best analog would be biological warfare. We have learned so much about germs and diseases in the last couple hundred years on how to solve it, how to cure it, how to treat it. But at the same time, if we didn't have the systems in place, think about how easily a bioengineer could wipe out the entire human race by deliberately weaponizing a superbug. And that's where we need to be focused on, is making sure that we have oversight on who has access to the technologies, what the trainings are, and have serious repercussions if someone goes off the rails with it. We do that with nuclear, we do that with biological, we are just starting to scratch the surface on AI, but we, those in the legislature today, are going to be the tip of the spear, and 2 generations from now, people are either going to be looking back and saying, thank God they did the right thing to keep it under control for the betterment of humanity, or shame on them for allowing the destruction of what took us thousands of years to build. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Can you follow up on that?
I would submit that legislators and lobbyists are irreplaceable. But lately I saw the figure 97,000 legislative proposals or laws in the 50 states this year. About 1,000 of those were products of you and your colleagues. A few of those did concern AI. And if you're going to NCSL shortly, it'd be worth paying attention to the AI presentations that they plan, because I'm sure that will include what some other states have already looked at, and that will be an item to report back as well. But as Chair King put it so well, this is here to stay. It's going to stick around, and you will be called on by citizens and interest groups and companies and others to do something about it. You can almost bet on that, and appreciate our friends here giving us some context and perspective. There's a lot of work to do.
Thank you. And that's something you did talk about. My wife's a retired teacher, especially I know in Scott County where they use 100% Chromebooks. They can replace, I think they're telling me 5 Chromebooks for every 1 textbook. So they just went 100% Chromebook wide in the district. That's something kids can start using as a one-on-one tutor, which is a great asset without a doubt. Again, but my only thing, I wish AI had been around when I was in college. My term papers would have looked a lot better. But thank you. Very interesting. Any last questions, guys? Interesting presentation day. There's a lot of, like I said, we're just at the tip of the iceberg. This is something we're going to have to deal with very shortly in the future. I look forward to having a discussion with you guys going forward. I know there's also some other groups that want to talk to us about AI, and I look forward to hearing their presentation also. But very interesting presentation day. Thank you, guys. Any last questions before we adjourn?